It's okay.
Okay.
Right. So today we welcome Professor Aaron Sloman, Professor Emeritus at the School of Computer Science at the University of Birmingham. I have, most people in the School of Computer Science here have memories of long discussions with Aaron about a variety of topics. So it's a great pleasure now to have him speak to us about this topic on this metamorphogenesis project that he has almost single-handedly been pushing for the last several years. And the title itself is interesting, right? So it says recently hatched ideas about hatching an intelligence using very low energy physics and chemistry at normal temperatures in egg-laying vertebrates. So this is something that I have heard in early versions of this talk. This is really interesting. I find this project and this topic very different from how many people look at problems in AI and other related disciplines. So I hope you all will also enjoy this talk as much as I'm sure I will. And so without any further longer introduction, I will just give it to Aaron, and so he can tell us about his new recent developments in this area.
Okay, thank you. I'll switch to a different screen and I will use a website. It may or may not be useful, but I suppose if I can copy the URL into the chat window, anyone who wants to can then access it. I think that would work for other people as well. Anyway, so this will be available. It'll probably go on being changed. I never finish anything. That's one of my problems. And what you see now, I had a lot of changes last night, partly as a result of a conversation I had with Jackie Chappell, who's one of the people I've been interacting with over many years. She came to Birmingham in 2004 after working in Oxford in the in a lab where they did research on animal cognition. And some of you may remember in 2002 there was a very famous video of a crow, New Caledonian crow called Betty, who had learned to get food out of a tube, vertical glass tube, using a hook that was provided for her. The hook was on the table, and both she and Abel, the male crow who also was given this test, would see the hook, pick it up, and then put it down the tube and fish out the bucket of food. And one day the experimenters forgot to put the hook out. Betty looked around, didn't see the hook, but saw a straight piece of wire. So she picked it up, and she actually made a rather clumsy hook by sticking it into the side, into the stuff around this, holding the tube in place at the bottom. And they wondered if that was some kind of, and then she got the bucket out, but it was, the hook didn't work very well, but it did work. So they took that hook away and set up the experiment again with a piece of wire available, and Betty once again took the straight piece of wire and made a hook. And they repeated this, I think, about 10 times. I can't remember the exact number, but, and each time Betty made a hook and used it to get the food out of the vertical glass tube. But what they didn't say in the publications, and I only discovered only after I'd heard about this and went exploring their website and found the videos that they had got there, what they didn't say was that Betty made hooks in several completely different ways. So even after she had found one of the ways that was shown on the video, where she stuck the end of the wire into the stuff holding the tube vertical at the base, and she then moved the other end of the wire around, and the stuff that was holding the far end caused it to bend near the far end. Anyway, that was the one that was shown in the videos, and that worked well. But even after producing that very successful hook, she continued making hooks in new ways. And that just sort of blew my mind. And later on, after I started talking to Jackie, she'd come here, we had a whole lot of discussions about the relationship between the genome and evolution. And I had been talking about Waddington's epigenetic landscape. He has this image of a genome as providing a kind of landscape, and each individual, as it develops, goes down this landscape and is moved around by structures on the landscape. And Jackie, when I brought this up, said, no, it's better to think of the genome as rebuilding the landscape as it goes down. And that comment was started of a whole lot of interactions which have gone on intermittently over the years, including the last few days. But most of the time in the last few years, she has been very busy with other things. She and a colleague in biosciences do a lot of work on rehabilitation of captured orangutans, and you can't just take them and put them in the forest if they've been in captivity since very early life. It just doesn't work. So it's a very time-consuming project, and she also has a lot of tasks in the school because of people being ill and so on. So she couldn't join us this morning, unfortunately. So I won't be able to get help from her. But anyway, that's Jackie Chappell, and there's a link to her website on the slides here. Now, I'm going to show a slide that's based on my conversations with Jackie after Susan Stepney, who's one of the people who's with us today, whom I've also known for a long time. In fact, Susan heard presentations that Jackie and I gave and invited us to contribute a paper to a journal that for which she was producing an edited version that was published in around 2006 or 7, I can't remember exactly. So she has, and intermittently, Susan and I have met at meetings and talks and so on. And a little while ago, I wrote to her about some of my most recent ideas, which have only happened since January this year, which I'll come back to. And she sent me a hand-drawn diagram of how she understood what I was saying. And then last night, I was going to use her diagram, but I decided to enrich it. And as a result, I now have a rather more complicated diagram, which I will show you presently. And Susan can take some of the credit for that. So what I want to do now is just slide down this, reminding myself of some of the things I need to say. One is that part of the history of this talk is that there's been disagreements about the nature of mathematics and the nature of mathematical knowledge. My first degree was in maths and physics, and I thought I was going to be a mathematician. But I got interested in philosophy partly as a result of going to meetings of student religious societies and heckling, because I thought they were all talking nonsense, and I thought they should know they're talking nonsense. And one of the people there was a highly intelligent philosophy research student who was he accepted the theology I was criticizing, but he was very kind to me and said, you need to improve your criticisms. Read this. And he gave me Russell's History of Western Philosophy to read. And that introduced me to ideas, Russell's ideas and Kant's ideas about mathematics. And Russell thought Kant was wrong, and I thought Kant was right and Russell was wrong. So as a result of that, I started moving into philosophy. And well, anyway, a whole lot of things happened after that, which I won't go into, but including getting into AI under the influence of a researcher called Max Clues in 1969, 71. Anyway, so over the years, I've been trying to show why Immanuel Kant's views of mathematics are right and why the rival views are wrong. And I'm going to come back to that later. But I think that I now think, although I didn't when I first thought of defending Kant, that if we want to understand why Kant is right, we have to understand the role of chemistry in the development of brains, and not only brains, but whole bodies and so on. And most recently, I've realized, and when I say most recently, this was around about the end of 2020, or I think it was that winter, I suddenly realized for the first time that I have never thought about what happens inside eggs that enables animals that come out of eggs to be highly competent. And I'm going to see if I can show you an example of what I mean. I've got over here a link to a video a clip of a video from a BBC Spring Watch program, which was shown last June. And when I saw this and said how marvelous it was, my wife said, pause it, replay it, and video it. And that's what you're now going to see if this works. So let me get this up. You should now be able to see, sorry, I've paused. Could you hear the sound when that happened?
Yes, we can.
You could, okay. Right, so I don't need to talk. So that's the avocet sitting on a group of eggs, and I'll let the commentator carry on.
She's a little bit fidgety, and there's good reason, because as she stands up, two against three little jigs already out of their eggs. It wasn't long before all four of the jigs were hatched. So they're all going tumbling up, head down to the water straight away, and start to forage. Now, they won't fledge for another 4 to 5 weeks. They'll stay around the island, stay with their parents, get food at night.
Okay, that's what I wanted to show you. Now, I don't know if anybody watching has watched newly hatched chicks, ducklings, swans, alligators, turtles, or any others, but there's a wide variety of species. Let me get out of this. A wide variety of species that soon after hatching, display competences that they have not had any opportunity to learn. I mean, for instance, newly hatched chickens will walk along the ground pecking for food, and they'll go to their mother or follow the mother. So there's a lot of competence that very few of our current robots could come even close to matching, that newly hatched animals can have, that need to be explained somehow. Where do they get those competences? Well, obviously it must somehow come from the genome, and that means that it must come from processes that go on inside the egg. But what is an egg? An egg is a structure that is surrounded by a shell, which is partly pervious. Gases there may be some gas exchange, gases going out and gases coming in, but very little else. You won't get food coming in there to feed a developing chick. It's got to be fed, to make use entirely of the chemical stuff that's inside the egg that was put there by the mother when the egg was created. And somehow the single cell that's got DNA in it from mother and father, and later I may have time to talk about the implications of the fact that this is sexual reproduction, where there are two genomes and therefore two strands of inheritance coming in and merging, unlike the normal picture of evolution as showing things diverging in time. There's also merging in time because of that and other things. Anyway, so the newly hatched, the newly laid egg will have very little visible structure. There'll be, I think I had a picture of an egg, but I won't show it now. So the question is then, how does the process that starts with a single cell, which starts dividing and getting more complicated and making copies of itself, which are not exactly the same, and they get more and more different, and they all work together. How does all that happen? And how is it all controlled? Now, my claim is that the early stages of all of that are very well known, coming out of the work of Watson and Crick and Franklin around 1952, and a lot of work that followed on from their discoveries. But my impression is that the parts that are well understood really only account for most of the early stages of cell division and do not address the problems that I'm going to talk about of how, as the developing organism, the chick or whatever it is inside the egg, gets more and more complicated, more and more highly differentiated, there's a problem of how further developments are coordinated. So when you have, for example, a partly developed stomach and partly developed heart and partly developed lungs and all sorts of partly developed bones, and these things are all continuing to develop, all those developments need to be coordinated. Now, they can't just do their thing separately because part of the development is joining them up. There are nerve fibers that go from one part of the system to another, and other nerve fibers that also go back in the opposite direction. And the same of blood vessels. There are tendons. There are various structures that provide rigid support, bones, for example, for other, and they supply support for others. There's covering skin, and in some cases, there's covering feathers, in others covering scales, and so on. So all those things need to be grown and assembled out of the relatively amorphous chemical structures that are available inside the egg originally. I say relatively amorphous because there are a few subdivisions, like the division between the yolk and other parts. But the process of assembly requires a huge number of molecules to be disassembled, and the components, the atoms, reorganized in very complex and increasingly complex ways. And this is happening in parallel all over different parts of the newly growing body inside the egg. And how is it all coordinated? Now, there are people, for instance, one of them, have I got a link here? I'm going to come back to the thing later. Anyway, Mike Levin at Tufts University is one of people who's looking at things that happen when organisms, the relatively simple organisms like slime mold, for example, which is a kind of fungus, reorganize themselves. This thing can spread out tentacles. Some of you will have seen it. It spreads out tentacles over a surface. If it finds food, then it may bring in some of the tentacles that went in one direction and use their substance in the region to grow out new tentacles where the food is, and so on. And if that food dries up, it can change its shape and so on. Now, that is a collection of global shape changes of a relatively homogeneous structure, which is at the fine grain, not homogeneous. Of course, it's got a lot of molecular structure, which is complex. The stuff that does the digestion of food and so on, it must be pretty complex. But it doesn't have something like a skeletal structure and a vein and artery structure and a nervous structure and a muscle structure and a whole lot of other structures, all coordinating it and all being reconfigured simultaneously. So the mechanisms that suffice for these relatively well understood self-organizing structures leave, I think, totally unexplained how you get the self-organization that goes on inside an egg. And I've been thinking about that and talking about that and trying to get feedback on questions I ask and so on since, as I said, about late 2020. And some of you have heard me give earlier talks about that. Now, during those earlier talks, I got one of my old diagrams. Oh, I should have prepared this better. Anyway, I'll just say what was in. So some of my old diagrams indicated that during development, things inside the egg could get more complex, but they needed to be controlled because of the factors that I've just been talking about. And I suggested that they might be controlled by some kind of virtual machinery. I assume that the audience we've got now know about virtual machines that can be implemented. For instance, this Zoom meeting is a very complex virtual machine. But the suggestion was that there could be virtual machines implemented inside the egg, which are organized, related by electrical or electromagnetic signals of some sort, which allowed the various parts of the assembly process to continue in a coordinated way. But my thought was that this task gets more complicated as there are more structures to be assembled in a coordinated way. And that means that the assembling process needs more intelligence. It needs to be able to cope with more information about what's already there and what's possible and what needs to be done next. So I was waving my hands about how this coordinating system needed to be able to change itself into a new coordinating system at various stages during development. And how that happened was a mystery to be explained, except that I assumed that it was just part of the process that was going on. And what happened in January this year was that I had a new thought which I'm going to try to relate to this diagram, and perhaps other things that I'll come to now. So, and this is a modified version of a much modified version of a diagram that Susan Stepney sent me recently when I sent her my ideas about what we were talking about. So this here is supposed to indicate changes in 2 dimensions. That's evolutionary changes and then the developmental changes. And Susan suggested that in early stages, well, I won't blame Susan for anything more. I'll just talk about the theory. In early stages, in the early history of our species and many other species, there were very simple structures in which there was an egg cell with something that enabled it to start subdividing itself and producing some new structure, which would produce hatching or birth. And then that thing would continue growing. And then later it would become an adult, which could move around and feed itself or whatever. In most cases, it would be swimming in liquid in the early stages. So what we have to think of evolution as doing, which I've tried to indicate in this diagram, but I'm not sure I'll succeed, is adding not just more complexity in the final products of gene expression, but more complexity in the mechanisms that control those products, control the assembly. So at a later stage of evolution, we might have something that's going to produce an organism that's got some body and it's got some machinery for controlling behaviors, of VM, virtual machinery. And those two might be grown in parallel as portions of the egg subdivide and differentiate and get connected together. But what I'm now going to suggest is that in later evolution, when the developmental changes were much greater and the different stages of assembly of a new organism differed more than in the older organisms as they evolved, there are more different stages in the assembly of, say, a chick, because there have to be things that happen before there's any skeleton and things that happen when there's a partial skeleton and things that happen when there isn't a blood supply going around. There are things that happen later when they are. So we need to have mechanisms that add to the sophistication of their abilities to control what happens by creating new virtual machines. Now, there's a crucial step that I've left out and was in the message to Susan, which for some reason somehow slipped my mind. My brain's going downhill, as you'll see. It may come back later, but the main point that I was making was that if you think about how these things change, you can see that the need for more and more levels of control it becomes obvious, and that includes levels of control which add new levels of control. And I think the point that's hardest to grasp is how one could explain how that happens through an evolutionary process that doesn't require any magic. Well, for now, I'm going to just assume that if we understand the process of evolution and think of how changing a species, which adds new structures, may require simultaneously changing the mechanisms that that species uses to assemble instances, we can begin to see, at least in a high level way, without understanding any of the chemical details, that evolution may well have produced something that fits in with this sort of diagram. Perhaps I'll pause for a moment to find if anyone wants to point out any thing that I should have said or could have said, or to ask any questions. I will hear you if you talk. Okay, silence, fine. So we'll now continue. I may come back to that diagram later. Now, I'm going to try to explain why Immanuel Kant is important here. There's a current fashion which has spread all over the world for developing and using neural nets to design systems, which, as I expect you all know, are designed by being trained on lots of examples from which they derive statistical information about relative frequencies of things that happen. And if you do this, you're more likely to get that result. And if you do something else, you're more likely to get a different result. And these neural nets with many layers that are trained one on top of another and so on are able to do quite sophisticated things. And many people believe that the mechanisms that are used in these artificial neural nets that are based on collecting statistics and from those statistics deriving degrees of probability that enable decisions to be taken. Many people believe that that's what goes on in animal brains, and that's the basis of intelligence. There's a vast amount of research going on now and a lot of what's now called artificial intelligence makes use of those mechanisms. There's also a lot of work in artificial intelligence that makes use of a different type of mechanism, namely logical inference, where you have symbolic structures, axioms, rules of inference for transforming symbolic structures. And those have got increasingly powerful. And for instance, many theoretical computer scientists use those in developing things that will prove that computer programs meet their requirements, where the requirements are expressed logically, the specification of the program is expressed logically, and the theorem prover can show that this program meets those requirements. Now, what I want to say about logic of that sort is that it's a relatively recent development. Ancient humans had some logical ideas, and they were used, for example, by Euclid in his presentation of geometry. But what we think of as modern logic involves a lot of structures that I think are only a few centuries old. The specification of formal discrete structures and rules for changing those structures and using those to construct proofs and so on, those are relatively recent, including, of course, the recent work on the limitations of those things done by Gödel and others. So I want to suggest that if anyone tries to explain how ancient eggs, do some of the things that I'm going to talk about, namely discovering that some things are impossible and therefore not worth trying, or the things that hatch out of eggs discover those things. If anyone who thinks that those are done by logic, I think have a difficult task explaining how ancient evolution could have made the discoveries that modern logicians have made in the last few hundred years. And I don't think evolution did do that or made use of that. On the other hand, it did provide the mechanisms that later enabled humans to make those discoveries. And that's a topic I'm not going to discuss today, although it's a very interesting question. How did that happen? Okay, so what I want to say is that there are spatial kinds of impossibility and necessity whose discovery is not just a matter of finding high and low degrees of probability, but as Immanuel Kant pointed out, 1781, involves abilities to discover that some things just are possible and others are impossible, or that certain changes to something will necessarily have certain consequences. And here's an example. Some of you will recognize this kind of thing. If I ask you whether the figure A can be superimposed on figure B simply by sliding it around in the surface, I think you will all find it obvious, though you won't necessarily find the answer, find it obvious to explain how you find the answer obvious, but you will find it obvious that this cannot be superimposed on that. And likewise, if I say to you, here are these two and C is another one, if those are fixed and C is allowed to slide around, which one can C be superimposed on, and which one can it not be superimposed on, and you'll easily see what's going on. The question is, what is your brain doing when I ask you to do that? And if I say, what would happen if I flipped C over and slid it around the plane? Would that change the spiral that it can be superimposed on? You'll almost, I expect everyone watching this will find the answer to that obvious. If you flip C over, you're going to be able to slide it to superimpose itself on that. And the question is, what are brains doing when they do this sort of thing? Now, if you have never seen something like this before, and you haven't done all these experiments in order to find that all your attempts to slide this onto that to superimpose them fail, you can't make use of a long history of trying and failing to say that you make use of a low degree of probability of success. Something completely different is going on. You can see that it is impossible, but I don't believe that we understand exactly what it means to say that you use your brain to see that that's impossible. I think that that is a gap in current neuroscience. And I think that to fill that gap, we may well have to go back to understand ancient chemical mechanisms which played a role in the assembly processes. That's my claim. And I believe that if we can do that, we will then answer the question that Kant asked about how it works. And in 1781, used a phrase which I have quoted here: this schematism of our understanding in its application to appearances and their mere form is an art concealed in the depths of the human soul, whose real modes of activity nature is hardly likely ever to allow us to discover and to have open to our gaze. So Kant thought that these processes that he had identified, in my view correctly, of about whose nature he'd identified about mathematical discovery as involving discoveries about impossibility and necessary consequences of spatial changes and spatial structures. He thought we might never understand how that works. And I'm suggesting we may, but we'll have to understand a lot more about evolution and brain chemistry and how evolution produced mechanisms that make use of brain chemistry to do things that are different, both from statistics-based neural nets and also from the logic-based reasoning systems that are a few hundred years old. Now, when I read about Kant and thought, yes, I think he's talking about what I learned to do, because when I went to school, we were taught to do geometry and we were given problems and constructions which showed find a construction that'll do so-and-so and then prove that it will do it. And that was no longer taught to the same level after horrible and totally misguided changes were made in mathematical education for very bad reasons, partly led by a French group of mathematicians who thought that mathematics had been shown by all the recent work in the 20th century and earlier, mathematics had been shown to be really all based on logic, they thought. And they thought that students should start learning logic earlier, and logic and set theory and related things. And then they would start learning geometry in terms of formal systems and their consequences. And I thought when I heard about this, and think now that that was a totally disastrous, had a totally disastrous impact on mathematical education. And by the way, I'm not the only person. The inventor of fractals, whose name I've temporarily forgotten, made that comment in a lecture that I heard him give.
Mandelbrot.
Sorry? Someone gave
Mandelbrot.
Oh yes, Mandelbrot. That's right. Thank you very much. By the way, my brain is losing all kinds of things, and I need help, and I don't mind getting it from anyone. Yes, Mandelbrot made that comment, and I think he obviously he was a great mathematician, which I'm not, but I believe he made the comment for the same reason as I thought it was a dreadful mistake, namely that the processes going on when you make discoveries in geometry, including his discoveries about fractal geometry, that are not reducible to operations on symbolic logical structures in the way that the many of the 20th century logicians thought, or some 20th century mathematicians thought, but neither are they mere empirical generalizations in which probabilities are derived by collecting statistics. He proved theorems about his fractal structures, and they were not just things with a high degree or low degree of probability because of statistical evidence. And likewise, the claim that the flipping C over will not enable you, will change which of these things it can coincide with, is something you can see not just as a basis of a lot of experiments in which you discover probabilities. You can perceive relationships between structures that make things impossible or make other things necessary consequences of some of the things you've noticed. Okay, so around 1969, and around 1959, I switched from maths to philosophy in order to try to show that Kant was right, and I produced a thesis. And I wasn't happy with my defense of Kant, and I'm still I'm filling in gaps in that the thesis that was produced in 1962 to defend Kant more in a sounder way. But we'll come back to Kant later. Now, one of the questions you can ask about this thing is what would happen if you put those spirals on the surface of a torus or on the surface of a sphere? If you put them on the surface of a sphere, you could slide them around, and you could investigate which ones could be superimposed on others. And you might find, and I think you will find, that that doesn't change anything compared with what you find if they just slide around on a plane surface. But if you put them on the surface of a torus, namely a kind of rubber tube, you know what a torus is, would that make any difference? And I'm leaving that as an exercise, which I hope some of you will enjoy thinking about. And then you may or may not come back with an answer you want to email to me, and I will add it to, if I get interesting replies, I'll add them to this website. So what happens if you put all that on the surface of a torus? I'll now move to some other things. Right, my claim that I've already implicitly made is that spatial intelligence and the ability to discover things that are possible or impossible is not restricted to mathematicians or even to humans, because I think that a lot of animal intelligence, for instance, the intelligence of squirrels, depends on their abilities to detect that certain things are impossible so that they don't waste their time trying to do them. And they may also detect that things that are impossible can be made possible if something is changed. And so a squirrel that tries to get to a nest by climbing up towards it and finds it's impossible, for instance, because the bottom of the nest is guarded by a large shield or something, might look around and realize that if it climbs onto something like a fence nearby, whose top is higher than this shield, then it would be possible, if it can jump onto the shield, to get at the nest. And there's a video online somewhere that I should have produced a link to, but I've got it buried in somewhere on my website, of a squirrel doing exactly that, climbing up onto quite a tall fence and leaping across, and at first not managing to land safely on the dome that was protecting the nest. The nest was above a dome. It fell off, but tried again, and it managed to land on the dome and grab the nest. And then it was, sorry, not the nest, the feeder with the nuts in it. It was able to grab the hold of that, and then it could feed itself. There are other things showing squirrels defeating bird feeders. And what I'm getting at is this depends on their ability to look at and reason about spatial structures and mechanisms in their environment, and to work out that certain things are impossible and certain things are possible, and in some cases to work out the necessary consequences of what's possible. And what I'm claiming is that those abilities have similar evolutionary origins to the abilities of ancient human mathematicians who made discoveries. But they didn't just make discoveries that they could use, they also were able to communicate about them and teach other people to make those discoveries. And as a result of various kinds of social interaction, the processes of making discoveries and mutual criticism and collaboration led to much deeper developments in understanding of what is and isn't possible in spatial structures in humans than in the other species. But I think it wasn't just that the humans could communicate. I think biological evolution produced additional stages in human development, including stuff that Jackie Chappell and I wrote about around 2005. And in fact, the first version of that was published in Susan's journal in what we call the meta-configured genome. And I think I've got something about that here. Well, I think I'm not going to have time to go into that because I've taken too long to get here. But the main point about the meta-configured genome is that we postulated that there are parts of the genome that remain unexpressed. So the gene expression is a complex process whereby chemical processes happen and new things are structured, developed. But we postulated that in the case of humans and also other intelligent species to a lesser extent than humans, have parts of the genome that wait. They are not expressed at birth. I think I've got a diagram that I can find here. But much later, and right, so that early genes that are expressed produce behaviors and that interaction with the environment, which produce records that are saved over here. Then later parts of the genome that developed later may be expressed later, and they may, when they're doing that expression, make use of stuff that was acquired by the earlier processes of recording information, so that the information that comes from the genome may have schematic structures with parameters that are filled in by information that comes from here. And then that produces new and more complex behaviors, interaction with the environment, more stuff is learned and stored. And then later still even more higher level genome, gene expression processes happen and get information at different stages of gene expression from the information that was stored previously. And then that leads to more complex competences and also the production of new and more complex motivations and theory constructions, which lead to more complex behaviors. And so this goes on. Now, I don't think there's any current robot that has anything remotely like this kind of architecture. And that will partly explain the relative stupidity of current robots, although many of them are doing very sophisticated, very complicated things, which are very narrowly focused in connection with a particular domain, for instance, a particular sort of assembly line in a factory. The robots may do things humans can't do and may do it faster and far more precisely and so on, because they've had very rich and complex programming and training, which honed those competences. But they didn't do it in this kind of way, the kind of way that humans did. It was done under the control of external agents, the human developers. Anyway, so I now want to suggest that if Immanuel Kant had thought about this, which I have no reason to believe he did, but I think that if he had thought about it, he might well have said, not forever lying hidden in the depths of the human soul or whatever he thought. We can begin to understand this kind of stuff if we develop some new ways of thinking. And now I'm claiming that those new ways of thinking that we need involve thinking about what chemistry can do and how that can be used over and over again to extend the powers of complex machines in new ways. So where have we got to, and what is there anything? Okay, there's a huge amount of stuff in this document. I will go back to a torus briefly. There's another collection of questions. I ask questions about what would happen with a triangular structure in a torus, but you can also sorry, not about those impossible, about those spiral structures. You can also ask questions about what happens if you have circular structures on a torus, namely closed curves. And they may go around the outside, they may go along the surface of the tower wall, they may go along the inside. You can ask questions about which ones can be superimposed on others by continuous deformations. And I once had quite a lot of fun thinking about that. And I came to go to the conclusion that some things are not mutually deformable. For instance, this yellow thing here cannot be continuously deformed into this red one. It's not totally obvious why not, but it can't be. But then I wondered how many more classes are there? That means there are at least two classes, namely the curves in the surface like that, and things going around, which could be moved around. And here's a question I will leave to people who are watching this. And you may be surprised if you work out the answer as to how many different equivalence classes there are of mutually continuously deformable closed curves, non-self-crossing, simple closed curves on the surface of a torus. And you may also find that you're capable of doing forms of reasoning that you hadn't realized you could do. But my deeper question about that is, I don't think anybody knows how brains can do that kind of reasoning about why this sort of curve cannot be continuously deformed into that one on this surface. And so there's a lot of work still to be done. And none of our, if any robots do it, they might be able to do it by using some sort of axiomatic specification and using logic, but I don't think any of them can do it in the way that humans would do it. Right, I've gone on for a long time. I've said most of what I want to say about it, and I have lots more stuff in here. Oh, this is an example that I found in Wikipedia. The question is, could these two rings, you can probably see I have a couple of rings which seem to be made of stone on this, hanging on this thing here. And the question is, could these two rings have been carved from two separate blocks of stone and then brought together? And given what you know about blocks of stone, and if I say brought together without having to smash them bits apart and then rejoin them, but just brought together after they had been carved in these shapes, I think you know what the answer is, but you may not know how your brain works out what that answer is. And that's the challenge, or just another example of the challenge that I'm raising for everybody here in this talk, and for many other people on the planet who are making assumptions that I think are completely misguided. Okay, I think that in this sort of way, we can see that Kant had deep insights that were basically right, although he didn't know why they were right. David Hume, who was also a brilliant philosopher, hadn't got as far as Kant in some of his deep insights, but I suspect, I don't know, and I never will know, but I suspect if he had met and talked to Kant, he would have agreed that he had not made enough distinctions because he was such a great philosopher and so intelligent. But unfortunately, many contemporary philosophers have never even understood this debate, and therefore they don't teach their students about it. And as a result, we have philosophers all over the planet who have no idea of any of the stuff that I've just been talking about, which is I regard as very sad, both for them and for the future of philosophy. Okay, should we have a break of a couple of minutes and then continue? I'm not hearing anybody. Would anyone like a break? No one seems.
I'm personally happy to go on, but
okay, all right.
Also have a break.
In that case, I will. I suggest we go back to gallery mode. Now, I presume I can do that, and then my screen will continue being shared. If I can remember, if I can find out how to go into, no, I've got the wrong thing. Shouldn't have done that. How do I get rid of that?
So what exactly are you trying to attempt?
I'm just trying to display all the participants in gallery mode and share that screen. But
maybe on the window on the right, where the
yeah, but I did something up here which took me into in the Zoom tool, which I don't want. I wanted to just get rid of it. And what happens if I shut the, okay, it's gone. So I can come back to here and where do I get gallery mode? Participants. Does anyone know how I should get the gallery?
Well, I assume at least if you stop sharing the screen, it will be definitely in gallery mode for you.
Okay,
But
so I'm pin that.
otherwise, I think this will do as well.
Right, I can stop sharing and then get back to Zoom. I've just knocked my mouse and everything was over the edge of the desk. Sorry about all that.
So thank you very much, first of all, for all the insightful ideas. I always find it quite exciting how many topics you're able to keep in mind and to combine in your whole idea of this metamorphosis project. So shall we hear some questions from the audience?
I guess if people want to talk, they can click on, they can raise their hand and then you can invite them.
You can also type questions in the chat and we can then bring them up just if you want. Okay, Dylan, please.
Hello. Let me see. Am I visible? Can you see me?
Dylan, you must be muted.
It's very quiet. We can just barely hear you.
Let me see if I can turn it up. Can you hear me? Can you hear now?
No, not yet.
No.
Do you have a mic you can? While you're doing that, I'll explain how I met Dylan. Many years ago, I got a letter, an email message from a student at MIT who'd been working with Marvin Minsky, saying he'd found one of my recorded lectures after a conference at Oxford. It was recorded interviews rather, and he had transcribed it. And he wondered if I was interested in the transcript. And it turned out he'd done a pretty good job. And so with his help, I produced a revised version, corrected, and then added it to the video so that anybody who wanted to could use his transcript. That was before we had systems like Zoom that could do that automatically. Okay, you've now got your microphone.
Let me try again. I'm not sure if you can hear me. Is this
you're
right?
tiny bit louder, but not enough. You don't have anything you can.
I'm attempting to fix it.
Can anybody hear him?
I can hear him, but it's
very faint.
I have to turn up the volume all the way.
Yeah, I'll have to try doing that.
Maybe if there are any other questions in the meantime, we can also.
Okay, if you pause still and
then
someone else once in a while. Ron, you need to unmute yourself and then we'll hear you.
Hi, Aaron. Yeah, thanks for that. I would like to understand a little bit more how you, what intuitions you have and how you bring them to bear when you look at the behavior of a system, how you're able to tell whether it's the kind of behavior that could be generated only through, generated through a statistical learning type process, whether it requires a logical reasoning type process, or whether it requires spatial learning. And I don't mean to say which of those processes do you think we use as a matter of fact in humans when we perform that behavior or learn that thing. But as a matter of computational requirement, how can you tell from the task specification and the behavior which of those different reasoning modes is required to achieve that behavior?
So an example, I assume you agree, would be, how can I tell that those ancient geometric and topological discoveries could not have been based on the use of logic and logical deduction from sets of axioms and definitions? Is that an example of your question? Because
Well,
that's one of my claims.
I'd like to keep it, that I'm not interested in that claim so much, because I'm interested in the computational processes that the brain is performing, not necessarily the activities that the human is engaged in, right? So
Okay, I missed the question. I understand now.
Let me just clarify one thing. Right. When we're wondering whether or not the physical stuff inside the egg is capable of achieving a certain kind of coordination or a certain kind of development with we're wondering which processes could possibly yield that development. I don't mean that there's going to be any people forming explicit languages of logic and proving theorems in that sense, but I mean, just because a probability of 0 is behaviorally, how could you tell that just giving something a probability of 0 is not going to be sufficient? You really do need to have a notion of impossibility, that systems that are capable of giving something a rating of probability 0 can never achieve. So I wonder what kind of behaviors do you know cannot be achieved through a statistical approach and require something beyond that you call the spatial reasoning approach?
I'm not sure that I would have to describe it in terms of behaviors, because given any behaviors that you want a robot to produce, you might, with sufficient training, if that behavior is specified in an appropriate way, might with sufficient statistical training, be able to get it reliably able to produce that behavior. So what I've been trying to do is to talk about kinds of what lies beneath certain human behaviors and what general classes they are instances of, and then what can be done in a general way to produce those sorts of competences of which those are instances. So for anything that a mathematician can do, for instance, by way of thinking and then writing down a proof, it might be possible, given enough million years of programming and training, to train a statistics-based system to be able, in response to a certain stimulus, to generate that sort of proof without being given the proof. But that fact is not necessarily going to explain how it happens in human brains. So I'm
interested in the egg. So what is it about the egg? I'm not just talking about behavior. I'm also talking about behavior in the context of the resource limitations, time and material available. So what is it about this resource limitations that make you conclude that can't be done through statistical learning? It requires something else, it requires some kind of spatial learning, spatial reasoning instead. How do you get to that conclusion?
The eggs in themselves, as far as I know, nobody's claimed that eggs do statistical learning while the hatching process is going on. But I suppose someone might claim that. And then the question would be, could that explain some of the phenomena that I'm talking about? That's a line of thought that had never previously occurred to me. But if that's the question you're asking, I can now understand it. So the question would be, do eggs of chickens have mechanisms that try things out, find what does and doesn't work, and then make use of that to produce a new stage, and then try lots more things out, find out what does and doesn't work, and then use that to produce yet another stage? I have never thought of that.
Or evolution could have done the statistical learning as well. So
that's a different.
Well, I'm just saying either of them would be an explanation, and yet you seem to be jumping beyond them and saying we can already tell that neither of those explanations are going to be adequate. Instead, we have to have a new kind of computational process here, a spatial learning process. And I just want to know how you get. I want to see I want to understand better your reasoning and how you get to that point and why you dismiss the two possibilities that I've raised.
Well, I'm not saying evolution can't do anything by statistical learning, because in some sense, that's what it does. But it does it in a huge space with vast resources, namely a whole planet, over a long history in which all kinds of changes happened, some of which held back or destroyed products of earlier evolution. And in some cases, external interference may have provoked new, well, it's often thought that the huge asteroid impact that killed off the dinosaurs was largely responsible for the subsequent development of mammals. At least I think I've heard something like that said. It gave a chance for these new creatures to develop in ways that they wouldn't have been allowed to if all the dinosaurs were around eating them. Anyway, I'm not myself able to, or even trying to, explain the history of evolution in that sense, but I do want to suggest that there are things to be said about the history of evolution in the diagram that, let's go back to it. I'd have to share screen again, the one that Susan sent me, where I had different columns showing ancient evolution, where you have something simple going through stages and so on, and then later stages of evolution, where the stages involved more complex transitions with particular properties that I was trying to characterize, including, in some cases, the production not just of new bits of stuff in an organism, but new kinds of machinery for controlling the assembly of the bits of stuff. And the argument there is the reason why evolution had to produce new bits of machinery to control the assembly of those bits of stuff is that those bits of stuff have properties that require coordination. For example, if you're building not only bones, but also blood vessels and nerves and muscles, and they all need to be coordinated because they grow together. You can't first build all the bones and then all the muscles and then all the others. They all have to be grown together. You need things that can do those different kinds of growth in a coordinated way. And that requires two things. One is getting information about what has happened so far at various parts of the system, and also using what is capable of happening next and selecting amongst those possibilities to fit in with what's happened so far and what's required to get the required end goal. I mean, you could always randomly try assembling all sorts of things, but you won't reliably produce a chicken by doing that. So what I, at that point, say is that the system that does that controlling can't do so by sending out feelers, physical feelers all over the place, and then getting information from those feelers and using it, because there's no room for all those feelers. And furthermore, the process of building all those physical feelers would itself require the same kind of coordination and control that we're trying to explain. So it's, at that point, the thought was there must be something like what we now understand to be virtual machinery that can be implemented in all sorts of distributed physical processes, as this Zoom meeting is implemented in a huge variety of physical processes, whose implementation may be changing all the time, because the physical, my vocal and visual signals coming from me that are going to the rest of you don't constantly go down a fixed channel on the internet. There are packets of information going and being rerouted constantly. So there's a virtual circuit whose physical implementation can be changing all the time. And I'm suggesting that things like that might also have been discovered by biological evolution and put to good use in the assembly processes inside eggs and brains later on. But that's part of the answer. But another part is that the processes of construction change in their nature, And I haven't said what changed. I haven't said today clearly enough what changed in my thinking in January this year, I think. It was, I tried previously to say that what I've just said, namely that the processes of evolution need to grow, sorry, the processes of assembly in the egg need to grow more complex. And I suggested that that happened as somehow as a consequence of processes of evolution in the past becoming more complex. But I couldn't produce a satisfactory argument that convinced other people, or myself really, that just because there was a need for something more complex at a later stage in the development of the egg, somehow that could be created to replace the previous controlling virtual machine that dealt with the earlier stages of assembly. And the thought that came in January from something someone said to me, and I can't remember who said it now. Anyway, the thought was that this has to do with the fact that in the evolutionary history of the species, the processes, now how's the best way to express this? The processes of assembly for earlier organisms had themselves a certain kind of a collection of capabilities. When something new was added to the species, this couldn't have been a continuous process. There must have been some sort of discontinuity to add new layers of structure and control in the actual species, the new organisms that were developed. And insofar as that kind of process can produce new things in the end product, a similar sort of process of adding something new, some new structure, might have produced new kinds of virtual machinery. So the suggestion was that the process of going from something with a very simple structure to a less simple structure required the assembly processes to be changed in a very specific way, which that diagram tried to indicate, but diagrams and hand waving are not adequate. We need to have research, biological research, into actual transitions going on, say in evolution, or examples where we have species that now coexist, but which have one of which is similar to common ancestor, and the other is different from that common ancestor, and looking at how those differences emerged and what kinds of mechanisms were required to produce that difference. But I guess the main point that I'm laboring and not saying clearly is that those processes of evolution have discrete changes. When a new species develops out of an old one, the genome has to change. There have to be discrete changes. And so that in itself might be part of the explanation of why the assembly processes have discrete changes. The process of adding all this new structure also adds new assembly mechanisms. That's also a discrete change. But this is still not precise enough. I don't know if it gives you any help in understanding what I'm saying.
We can continue the conversation at another time.
That statistical learning could have happened over the evolutionary timescales of the species. Well, this is something in the chat window from Susan. But we still have to explain how it gets into the gene, the results get into the genome. And if you say, well, that's also another statistical process, then I think we have a problem bootstrapping. But I think if I'm going to put if I can do that now, I'll put a link to Susan's diagram in case anybody wants to look at it. So where did I have that diagram? Part of this, it's all very well having a large number of web pages, but I think what happened was that I killed one of my web pages earlier, but I'll come to here where the diagram will definitely exist, and I can then add a link to it. Right. Copy. And I come back to my Zoom window and paste. There should be a link to a JPEG in the chat window. And that's what I showed you earlier. And it's supposed to indicate some of the discrete transitions. And it maybe doesn't answer Ron's question about why virtual machinery is needed. That answer comes from the question about what can go on in eggs, and the inability of the processes involving an egg to build new physical machines that do assembly processes and control the assembly of what, including the assembly of new assembly machines. Ron.
Yeah, so I didn't ask why virtual machinery is needed. As a matter of fact, I think that is, this might be interesting because you might see a connection that I don't see. I was talking about statistical learning versus logical reasoning versus geometric spatial reasoning. And when you spent all that time reminding me that about this diagram and about the different virtual machines and implementing other virtual machines, that I thought, well, that's orthogonal, at least it seems to me, to my question, because you could still have virtual machines created through on the basis of purely statistical learning. We know that continuously varying systems can nevertheless undergo phase transitions. So all your arguments about there needing to be discrete changes didn't seem to me to be very to cut one way or the other. It certainly doesn't argue for spatial reasoning that's different from statistical learning or rule-based, logic-based learning. So I'm still kind of left wondering why it is. It sounds like you think that because discreteness is required and because virtual machines are required and these different layers of virtual machines are required, that cannot be done through purely statistical learning, and it cannot be the result of an evolutionary process that just modifies things, modifies its parameters based upon statistical rules. I'm not quite sure of the relevance of the point about discreteness or the point about virtual machines. I was asking about.
Oh, well, perhaps the following points may be an agreement with what you're saying and an answer. Evolution is hugely statistically or probabilistic, and without that fact, we wouldn't have had the exploration of all the designs that evolution has explored. And that statistical variability is also a product of the physics and chemistry of the universe and the circumstances in which this planet happens to have developed and the things that have happened to it. I mentioned the impact of the asteroid, but all sorts of other processes that happened, which may or may not, some of which may have been deterministic once a planet of a certain sort in a particular position in the solar system had developed. Certain things with at a certain level of development were very likely or highly likely, but the low level details involved a huge amount of random variation, just because that's possible where you have lots of chemistry, especially chemicals floating around in liquids, or maybe chemicals floating around in gases to some extent also played a role in the case of very early stages of the planet. But certainly in the case of the whole solar system, chemicals in gases are important. In some of the current planets, they just seem to be composed of gases. Anyway, if you seem to be nodding now, so if you're asking how the whole process works without statistics, I'm saying it doesn't work without statistics. It depends crucially on statistics in order to generate the variation from which selections can then be made by all the Darwinian and other processes using mechanisms which are themselves products of these processes in bootstrapping processes, which then later become self-bootstrapping. They start extending themselves in ways that I've been trying to describe. And in particular, they start becoming self-bootstrapping in encapsulated biological entities that were able, once evolution reached a certain level, it was able to produce things that could be just created and then would do all sorts of things to change themselves, come out of the shell, get more food, and continue doing things, and then interact with other things, and of course produce more offspring. And in some cases, there'll be statistical variations in their reproductive processes, which change the offspring in subtle ways, which over hundreds or thousands or millions of years produce yet more changes. So there's everything deep down is enormously dependent on statistical variation. But the fast-acting, highly reliable mechanisms that produce a chick out of an egg couldn't be. Susan, unmute yourself.
Hi, yeah, thanks. I've been putting some stuff in the chat, but I think, one of the things that I feel that your virtual machine model helps, virtual machines in the brain, as well as virtual machines for constructing the body, are some of the questions like, how do we do geometric reasoning? Because as soon as you've got a virtual machine, you've got a completely or potentially completely different computational architecture from a neural net. So the neural net's just the atoms underneath, which can have been trained by evolution to have particular structures of virtual machines. And I think one of the things I'm interested in is how some of those virtual machines might simply be simulators of the real world. And I feel that when I'm doing geometrical reasoning, I am simulating the real world. I am mentally moving things around and seeing how they move. And so I also have virtual machines that can do logical reasoning, maybe not quite as well. But and I've got virtual machines in my head that do lots of these different styles of reasoning. And so this geometrical reasoning, I think it doesn't have to be a neural network statistics. It doesn't have to be symbolic logic. It can be a different sort of virtual machine, which is doing simulation of the physical world. And I think that answers questions of why it's a little bit harder to see what it does on a torus, but you can kind of see it reasonably quickly. But it's much harder to see what it does on a Klein bottle, a non-orientable surface. So I'm guessing that you can, therefore, on a Klein bottle, slide left onto right. And those videos that you linked to in your last talk about the guy having two Mobius strips at right angles, cutting them up and what happens, there is absolutely no way my virtual machine simulator could get that answer without having seen it a few times. So I think that's what's really exciting about the virtual machines, is it explains a lot of these different ways of reasoning and ways of thinking that we've got. And there's no reason a squirrel couldn't have a little virtual machine that's a simulator and it just sort of sits there and thinks. And obviously squirrels are much better than dogs, again, given some of the videos that you've shown us of their inability to maneuver sticks through small gaps. But I agree that the absolutely fascinating thing is how on earth the physical construction during the gestation and the of the chick in the shell, how that physical system can then construct the substrate on which those evolved virtual machines can run is absolutely fascinating. And the idea that you have to have more and more complex processes, it doesn't necessarily mean, I don't think, that the physical infrastructure for the less complex processes needs to be broken down, because once you've got a sufficiently powerful system, you can just reprogram it. You know, you don't have to throw away the computer that runs your simple code in order to have a computer that runs more complex code. It can all run, the computer can run more and more complex code once it's universal. So once you can build a virtual machine that is potentially universal, you can just reprogram that one maybe.
Well, I don't know to what extent human brains have something that's universal.
Well, actually, nothing can be universal, can it? Because it needs to be unbounded.
Right. I mean, I think that I think there are things human brains, the problems of storage and also of abilities to maintain a collection of very complex things and manipulate and compare them in parallel and so on. That sort of thing that theorem provers can do quite well. I think brains are just not designed for. But there was something that you said that reminded me of, what was it? It'll come back later, maybe. Yeah, the squirrels. Yes, there's something about different species which I find interesting. That some mammals, for example, dogs and cats, seem to lack kinds of intelligence that other mammals have, and that would be interesting to find out why. And the answer might simply be something to do with the evolutionary history of their ancestors. For instance, the fact that squirrels move around in trees may have imposed a lot of requirements on the development of the brains of their ancestors to avoid falling to their death by making mistakes that could be avoided by thinking ahead a bit, which didn't apply to the wolf-like ancestors of dogs that were mostly not in similar risky situations. They had other kinds of risks, and they needed to be able to do things like run fast and catch the things they wanted to eat, and run fast in the opposite direction from things that wanted to eat them or whatever. But so there may be a whole lot, and for all I know, evolutionary biologists have already studied a whole lot of examples of such evolutionary changes and pressures which lead to changes in competences of current species. But cats are very curious in the kinds of things that they do. There's a well-known video which is typical of this oddity of cats, or it used to be well known, of a kitten with a mug lying on the ground. And whenever this kitten or young cat saw the mug, it wanted to put its muzzle into it. So it would go put it in its muzzle in the mug, and then continue pushing forward and continue until it hit a wall. And then it would back away, presumably not feeling very well about it. And then it would do it again. So why on earth evolution should produce that kind of motivation, I think is very hard to understand. But it might be possible to show that that's a special case of something else that is easier to understand, something more general, which just happens to have this sort of special case.
Yeah, I also think, if I can carry on, that sometimes when we observe behaviors, they look a lot more intentional than they actually are, and so that rather than instinctual, whatever that means. And that was brought to me again with a video of a bird with making that was on an egg to keep the egg warm, and it was rolling the egg over so that it was being continually warmed on all sides. And it looked incredibly intentional as you watched it, of this bird making this movement that rolled the egg. And then they took the egg away and the bird made exactly the same movements. At which point, on the observation, it went from being completely intentional to hardwired idiocy.
It was doing it in empty space, moving empty space around.
Yeah.
That surprised me.
Yeah.
Yes, right.
It kind of felt there should have been an egg there, and it was trying to roll the egg, but there wasn't an egg there anymore. It was very peculiar. Yeah. And so, you know, I think, but I think this idea of actually having running simulators in your head of the physical world, there are some people in robotics working on doing that to give robots anticipation and being able to evaluate consequences of future actions and so on. So that might give them more of the kind of the geometric intelligence that you're looking for, rather than the statistical intelligence.
Well, it's not in the cases that I have seen, because those examples do not give the robot the ability to understand that something is impossible just because it has failed in all the situations that it has tried. And in particular, doesn't give the robot the ability, when confronted with a new situation that is different in some detail from the old one, to realize that the old impossibility transfers to this new situation, that difference isn't going to get rid of the impossibility. And so, for instance, if two things can't be separated just by moving them around, you might think, well, maybe if they were very much bigger, it would be possible. But if you've understood why this can't be done, then you understand that the limitation hasn't to do with the size, but to do with constraints on relative motion or something like that. So it's difficult to be precise in some of these discussions about what is being excluded and what isn't. And in particular, some of the stuff that can be done by training neural nets doesn't achieve the features that Immanuel Kant talked about, which is that these results, when they are acquired, are not mere empirical generalizations. They are discoveries about what's impossible or necessarily the case, which is different from an empirical generalization that gives you a probability. And that I have found amongst many people that I have been talking to over the last half century is an unfamiliar notion. And I partly blame that on changes in the education of mathematics at school. They no longer teach Euclidean geometry, where you get into your bloodstream this understanding that some things are impossible and you have to be able to prove that they're impossible, and some things are necessary consequences of, which is the same thing and so on. And by the way, did you learn geometry at school?
No, I was in the new maths with the set theory and the SMP mathematics program, which I think was utterly brilliant actually at teaching what it taught.
Okay, right.
But it didn't teach geometry in that way.
Right, yes, okay.
Anyway, thanks. Yeah, I'll
Right. Are there any other hands up? Anyone who wants to contribute? Now, Dylan, who previously wasn't able to talk to us for unknown reason, did post a message, 1124. One interesting aspect of the egg evo-devo process is the way in which the presence of virtual machines might encourage the lower level machines to evolve to better facilitate higher level virtual machines by, e.g., exposing useful knowledge, developing more compact representation, assembling a sort of API, application program interface. I'm reminded of how mutations often result in high level morphogenetic errors, such as duplicating limbs. Well, that's in the chat. It's quite a complicated thought. I think in some sense, what he's describing there is a necessary feature of the evolutionary processes that I'm talking about, that lower levels have to generate in their random way changes which can provide the basis for new developments that make use of new facilities that otherwise wouldn't have existed. And that may be related to what Dylan has mentioned there. He's no longer with us, so can't ask him. And there's another new message, several new messages. Oh, Dylan says, yes, that's right. I thought he'd gone, but I now see I hadn't looked in the right part of the screen. Yeah.
Okay, are there any other questions? We've slightly stretched the time already, but I think, Aaron, if you're happy to.
Yes, if other people
continue.
have things they'd like to contribute, I'm happy to listen and learn. Mike Ferguson has produced a link to stuff by Michael Shermer. I think I've probably seen that, but I'll take a copy of it anyway. Just
Martin, can you save the chat also along with the?
yes, we can ask
Yes.
Zoom to change. I haven't given the save command. Has anyone?
No. Martin is the host, so he should be able to
I
save.
have right now
Okay,
saved
right, yes.
the chat as well, yeah.
Just remember to do that, because once you close, it goes away, and it's good to
Right.
have a chat because there are a lot of useful
Yes.
links here.
Right. Let me see if there was anything else in the chat that I missed. That there's a link to Phil papers, which I haven't copied, which I will now, so I got it handy.
So Aaron will share the chat, so don't worry, not just you,
Okay,
but anyone
right.
interested, right? So you don't have to
Fine.
copy it right now. I mean, as in you
Fine.
can, but you don't have to
Yeah.
feel compelled to
Okay,
do it.
right,
Yeah.
yes. One of the things that I haven't mentioned today, although I have in other talks, is the abilities of pre-verbal children, which I think are grossly undervalued, underestimated, because by psychologists, because of what they look for. As one of them once said to me, they can't get publications unless they have statistical evidence to support their claims. And they get brainwashed into thinking in those terms. And therefore, they set up things where they can ask lots of children related questions and then find out which proportions produce which answers and so on, and maybe how that changes with age. And what you can learn from that is totally different from what you learn, as Piaget discovered early last century, Jean Piaget, the Swiss developmental psychologist. What you can learn by watching children, individuals over time, and perhaps interacting them and giving them challenges and seeing how they respond, and so on. Or even just watching them give themselves challenges, because one of the things about some mammals is that beyond a certain stage, the young do a lot of exploratory activity from which they learn. The young puppies playing together, young kittens playing together, young wolves and so on playing together, and also young monkeys and other primates. They can depend a lot on the interactions, baboons and so on, playing around on the surface. Jackie has worked a lot with orangutans, which are different in a very interesting way. As probably many of you know, and there was a wonderful thing about orangutans a couple of nights ago on BBC TV. One of the things about orangutans is that they move around a lot in trees. They are quite heavy, they're large, they're heavy. If they come down onto the ground, they can move, but they're not very fast. And it can also be involve a lot of energy if they want to get from one tree to another one where they see some food. Going down, moving along, and then going up can use up a lot more energy than a route, a roughly horizontal route through the tree branches would require, if such a route is possible. I learned that fact from Susanna Thorpe, who's one of Jackie's colleagues in the School of Biosciences. The two of them have worked together a lot to do with orangutans. Anyway, so the orangutans have learned, both for efficiency reasons and also for safety reasons, not being attacked when they're on the ground, to move horizontally or almost horizontally through trees, moving along branches to get closer to another tree in order to then bridge the gap, which they might be able to do if there's a branch in reach, or they might, in some cases, have to jump across the gap. When a mother is doing this while holding on to a baby, or rather while a baby is holding on to the mother, that can produce a kind of education for the baby that many animals do not receive. Many animals are not, human babies are often carried around on their mother's backs, but not while the mothers climb trees and move between branches and so on. So they may learn other things by being carried around on their mother's backs, but not what the orangutans learn. And one of the most spectacular things that goes on with orangutans, which is available on some videos, is what happens at night when the mother wants to rest. She dare not go down and rest on the ground for the reasons already mentioned. So she will build a nest up in the tree. And she's doing this while holding on to the baby, or to some extent the baby holding on to her unaided. And so she has to manipulate a whole lot of branches, interweave them and the leaves. And then when she's got a structure, to bring more things into the structure and so on, until it's adequate for the purpose, which can include providing a kind of shelter if it rains. In some cases, they assemble leaves above them to keep off rain. So they are performing tasks which are very complex and unique. Each one, every night, is unique because they're in a unique configuration of leaves and branches and twigs and so on, and distances and angles and sizes. And that means they have to develop generic competences that are able to be applied to a situation that's different from one they've encountered before. They can't just generalize on the basis of particular metrical values and relationships and construct these new structures. So one of the consequences of that is that came out of this recent program, television, is that if a baby orangutan is taken by humans, either as a pet, or they rescue it because for some reason, maybe the mother's died or whatever, they find this baby orangutan, and the humans start feeding it and letting it grow, it may get to a stage where it's incapable of becoming a normal orangutan, because it cannot, after what's happened, go through the learning processes that a normal orangutan goes through in order to develop the skills that it needs when it's moving around in trees. And it may even be that if you give it to a female orangutan that's willing to adopt it, it may be too late, depending on the stage at which that happens. I don't know if any females, some female animals, well, in fact, some animals adopt animals of other species. It's quite well known that a number of humans have been found that have been adopted by wolves and other species. And for those humans, there's a similar problem, that because they didn't get certain kinds of experiences at crucial stages in their development, in particular linguistic experiences, interacting with their non-human animals, they're totally incapable of using the brain structures that they have developed to get the linguistic structures, because those linguistic structures have to be developed in layers at different stages in specific ways. Anyway, the same sort of thing can happen for non-linguistic competences in other species, is what I'm saying. And I think that's related to Ron's question or comment. 3 new messages.
Aaron, at some point, I'm going to have to close the session because I know people on this call have to be at other places.
Sure.
So, yeah.
Well, I think people are saying goodbye. So that's the main thing that's coming up in the chat window.